Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the 38th paragraph of the second chapter of the second book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege, the title being How Far the Analysis of the Means Should Be Carried. The text follows. Another question is, how far should theory go in its analysis of the means? Evidently only so far as the elements in a separate form present themselves for consideration in practice. The range and effect of different weapons is very important to tactics. Their construction, although these effects result from it, is a matter of indifference, for the conduct of war is not making powder and cannon out of a given quantity of charcoal, sulfur, and saltpeter, of copper and tin. The given quantities for the conduct of war are arms in a finished state and their effects. Strategy makes use of maps without troubling itself about triangulations. It does not inquire how the country is subdivided into departments and provinces, and how the people are educated and governed in order to attain the best military results. But it takes things as it finds them in the community of European states and observe where very different conditions have a notable influence on war. This paragraph is conceptually very important because it substantially makes you understand where's really the limit between the political, social, and with the military proper. And this, however, has nothing to do specifically with how the single commanders actually operate, in the sense that, there is a level that is the strategical and tactical one they operate at, but at the same time, as we have seen in the previous chapters and also in the first book, essentially politics is ineliminable in the process. Like at a certain point, von Clausewitz says no general, no commander can actually think that that at any moment the way he is employing the military instrument is devoid of political interference, right? And it's always like that. And the same goes for society, as a matter of fact, because this is, you have to employ these means in a certain way, right? What von Clausewitz is doing in a certain way means that is supported by those means. So in this vision, von Clausewitz is substantially pointing out, though, that when we talk about theory, right, and highlighting what should pertain specifically to strategy, like in this case, we must make these distinctions, because that's effectively what the nature of strategy actually entails. Like, strategy works as a thing on its own that has naturally always, in reality, to take into account other factors, the political and social ones, but also it has its own very specific field and dimension, just like the military one actually has by itself. So this is a very important conception that we have encountered also in the previous paragraphs, but here it's von Clausewitz is focusing on it in a more precise and more dedicated way. And this is very significant for the strictly operational side of the story as well, because at one point strategy must be planned before you actually, make action following. So it's to be questioned in a theoretical field, in the theory of the art of war, where those, how far can we essentially make an hypothesis about whichever means we can create, because in the previous paragraphs we have seen that these means, like the armed forces, are employed in combination with lots of other factors that take place all the time, right, at any moment, right? So these form new means in turn with the other means you have, and it gives origin to basically an infinite combination. An infinite number of combinations that you can't quite cover, all conceptually speaking. So that's why in this paragraph, von Clausewitz legitimately asks, how far this analysis of the means should be carried, like how useful it is, because you could theoretically start thinking at every single, element can happen, but at that point you would freeze. You would not be able to take any action because you realize that there is even a component of blind courage needed in war at all times, because without that you basically would leave the initiative to the enemy anyway. So, but this is particularly important because it already makes you understand through a paradox that effectively not everything that is done in war is done with a scientific or positive intent in the terms of the application of the means themselves, but rather as a combination of the same means, which means, in fact, according to the laws of reciprocity that we have seen in the, I think in the first chapter, no, actually they were, in the first chapter, we have, in the first book, actually, we have observed that, as we were saying before, just leaving the initiative to the enemy, we don't know how scientifically how it will bring our destruction, right? But we know that happens because, hell, in war, this is what happens every single time. You leave the initiative to the enemy by a certain margin, of course. So the point of the story is that there is no way to calculate properly how this will happen, because this can happen in a multitude of forms that can occur, even in a single operation, that is useless to stop thinking, right, too much about, instead of acting, right? So in this paragraph, of course, von Clausewitz doesn't answer to the question of how you should do that, because once again, this is something you have to calculate yourself on the base of your military experience, whether deriving from actual command or from military history, and hopefully actually the two things combined, because without that, we'll see it ahead. Von Clausewitz says, you can't complete, you can't perfect. Without the latter, the knowledge of military affairs, as well as, it's quite rare that you can be a good strategic mind if you have never dealt with real strategic situations. And so this is also particularly meaningful, but it theoretically can happen. Like, it's a bit like trainers. Quite rarely they are, coaches. They quite rarely are people who haven't practiced that sport themselves, but it can happen theoretically. Well, that's a bit like war, right? And this is a good example I like to throw in. So yeah, how far the analysis of the means should be carried, and von Clausewitz writes, another question is, how far should theory go in its analysis of the means? Evidently, only so far as the elements in a separate form present themselves for consideration in practice. That is to say, you should always consider that the means you have at your employment must, at your service, let's say at your use, have to be employed with a strictly practical aim, like which you say, well, it sounds pretty banal. Well, it really does not, right? If you know where we're coming from in this sense, because von Clausewitz has criticized those positive theories of the art of war that pretend to take a mean, essentially, in thinking about it as abstracted from reality, right? It's like the principle of internal lines, these things of Jomini that, he even writes actually real things. He considers effectively things that have to do with line of fire, angles, and stuff like that. But the problem is, how much that will correspond to reality if you detach, like it in that case, from a concrete situation. And here von Clausewitz is making you reflect on this exactly by saying, yes, you should consider in that regard everything that can happen, but only when it happens, and when you know at that point how you can practically cope with the situation. But it goes beyond, because he actually means, as we will see now, that you don't have to think too much for strictly strategical ends about where those means come from, right? You should be essentially and that's where the practical side of the story really lays in, because it's basically telling you that you have to react with the means you have at your employment only when that situation that you have in front of you brings you to either use them or die, right? So at the very moment in which you have to employ them, not in a theoretical space that can be all, speculative, and that when reality will come, in front of you, you will not know how to cope with that, because you have thought so much that you basically don't even understand how in practice that thing should work, right? So to the strictly didactic side of the theory of the art of war, this means at your disposal must be considered as purely as the military instrument in itself, in combination with whatever let's say situation can happen to you, and how you can of course at that point go beyond and even try to catch all the possible combinations, but it starts becoming difficult. You have to approximate that expectation, let's say met with reality. But here the point is also how concretely, naturally, you have to you can't speculate, right? There is as von Clausewitz is the first guy in here that he's telling you, look, you shouldn't throw yourself into war without having planned, naturally, what you have to do. But that's more kind of a negative, let's say, provision you have to make in the expectation of the unforeseen than an actual trust that things will go in a certain way. And in that regard, you have actually to think about a lot of things, even potentially valid, but always realistic, always practical. Because you will have to employ that, and you have to use reason. And using reason has nothing to do with abstraction. Using reason is to become concrete at the point that you realize what is effectively more likely to happen in a certain situation on the base of experience. Because we have seen there is no other way, essentially, to formulate these judgments if not looking at what concretely happens in war, and kind of cumulating that knowledge and creating a theory through that. So not just leaving it there, but substantially identifying what is generally common to and likely to in all this system, and expecting that things will likely go in that way, always bearing in mind that they will actually never go as you have foreseen, but that at least you know which direction they will take, generally speaking, as a system, right? Even if not in the sense that you can't understand how the system of combat as such, but the fact that you can expect that if you stretch too much your supply lines, you will fail, logistically speaking, at one point. That's not something that needs even an actual demonstration, as long as you know what it means and that it's reality. And then the measure in which that will happen is related to many other factors you should be considered, for which also there is a hierarchy in the military that is essentially deputed to look at that at all the various levels. So that's why also, by the way, the let's say there is a simplification of information that is needed as well for the guys at the top to take to make accurate let's say decisions, but on the basis of a situation that we know that at that level, the strategical level, is way more difficult, in fact, to plan, exactly because you can't even in terms of intelligence take into consideration every single datum that arrives from theoretically up to down the ranks from the single soldier at the same time. So this is actually, and that's where many people, I think, fail to understand the genius of von Clausewitz, because they essentially say something, well, yeah, but what is the, the actual use that I can make of this information? The actual use you can make of this information is that there are not informations you can make use of in the way you mean. right? This is the single most important problem, because, if you go out there, even just simply, make a Google search, you find plenty of things like these, like that are criticizing, with all this massive, premise and structures, because, every time you talk about von Clausewitz, you have to write a lot to get to the point, because you have to tear this thing down. Well, no, because actually Clausewitz in principle is pretty damn simple. Like, it's simple in its effectiveness, and here von Clausewitz is not trying to look something that he's not. He's not trying to give you the exact formula on how, what you should do step by step. And if you think that, it's basically because you have failed to understand what he's telling you here. That there is no way you can effectively understand what will happen. And therefore you have to take into account this realization, and at the same time not to be so scared after all, because even if there is always that constant state of, of largely unknown, of ignorance, substantially, about most things that are going on, there are still certain steps you can follow conceptually that will make you assess, but always through experience, essentially how likely it is that something will happen. After all, we don't study military history saying, I don't know, this army could, jump to the moon and coming back and on the field. Like, we know that there is a limit. We know that there is a dimension to reality. And this is paradoxical, because it is exactly through that dimension that things go in unpredictable ways. But always within certain boundaries that, albeit, infinitely, enlargeable, I don't know, expandable, I don't know how to say that in terms of complication of analysis, at the same time are channeled within, certain tracks you can follow. And, alright, we will see this at one point better, right? Because I realized that this jump between theory and practice is, albeit it's essentially the same dialectical structure of the Vom Kriege, right? But it's not a contradiction. It's a paradox sometimes, actually, but it's real. But that's why this is counterintuitive, because intelligence and rationality are counterintuitive. Reality is never so simple as it looks, but at the same time, it's not even so truly unintelligible or copable with as we would think at a first glance, right? So that's very important to bear in mind. But maybe we'll have to expand on this naturally. But here von Clausewitz makes certain examples that are effective. He writes, the range and effect of different weapons is very important to tactics, right? Their construction, although these effects result from it, is a matter of indifference. For the conduct of war is not making powder and cannon out of a given quantity of charcoal, sulfur, and saltpeter, of copper and tin. The given quantities for the conduct of war are arms in a finished state and their effects. So, this is particularly clear, right? This is not a literal example about, what we should care about the range and effect of different weapons, in a tactical situation. He's making an example to make you understand that when you are in the field, you're using those weapons, you're actually not thinking about every single tiny atom that builds the thing, and all the various breaths of wind that can swing the trajectory of the bullet. You're simply knowing roughly that weapon does operate in that way, and you're essentially just trying to adjust it to your own sensitivity and to your own capacity of calculation of what the hell is going on around you, physically speaking. And not only because, by the way, you're shooting over someone that is not just a static dead target. It's someone who's reacting to that. So even if you score the best shot, you can't be sure at that point the enemy, if it's still alive, will whoever is around is going to cope with that. That's why, in fact, certain, like, what if it was 1 versus 1 in a completely, equal situation? Well, at that point, if there is such a huge asymmetry for which, that one side is going to lose, well, that side probably is not going to even appear on the field. And that's what happens in reality, in the sense that if there is a tactic that crushes an army that cannot cope with that, at that point, well, very likely that army will never represent itself on the field in the way it was before, right? Actually, no army does, independently from whichever tactics you employ in that. But even that, that changes a lot. Because at that point, if you're going to lose, you're not even fighting that way. You're going to invent, sort out something else. That's why you can't predict what the hell is going on. Because you have to do with a reacting adversary that is going to, not only take measures in that regard, but also taking measures in turn that you cannot foresee. Because if you're threatened to be killed by something, and the other guy from the other side that is trying to achieve that is just kind of feeling cool and satisfied by that, well, guess who is more likely to produce the best solution to sabotage the effectiveness of that kill? Like, it's you and not the enemy. So something that the enemy doesn't, and that you can't put to use at one point. Sometimes you can't because you get killed yourself. But in that regard, there is always the moral dimension of the story. Like, how much are you pressured? How much can you... in fact, you don't even have to pressure the enemy too much, right? It's risky many times, not all times. And this is what von Clausewitz is saying to you, right? And why it's useless to compare these thoughts. For example, I mean, lots of people will compare von Clausewitz with Sun Tzu. That's meant to be historically illiterate. How can you compare two systems that there is such a difference between them? Like, let's say, between Hegel's and Pythagoras ones, right? It doesn't make any sense. There are things that are kind of likely, but that you can make examples about, just like we're doing now. Von Clausewitz will tell you, well, that may not happen anyway. So you have to cope with that in a way or another. And not only that will not necessarily happen, but lots of other things will happen or not happen that you have not thought of and that will interact within the system. So that the result will be completely different from the one you were thinking of, right? And what is kind of like, many people say that this book is fundamentally not a philosophy, in the sense that it's not an opinion on what reality or what people should do, really. But in my opinion, this is actually a very sound philosophical treatise in the measure it's you can find examples aside from these metaphors that von Clausewitz uses on a regular basis that even enter the fields of, I don't know, physics, but even of proverbs and feelings, things that are psyche, but because you can find these examples in the same reality. It's like, where are you now compared to where you were thinking you would be 10 years ago? I mean, even if you more or less found out, in before what more or less you would be today, like, how many are the things that you had not things could happen that are actually happening right now? And think about it, because these are things that are changing your life, that have already changed it, and that will keep likely changing it in turn. So this is really where I want to bring you with von Clausewitz, because the mind automatically says, okay, but I want to stand on a firmer ground now. I want to stop and pretend that all this turmoil and maelstrom and currents of unpredictability will stop at one point, and we can actually ground ourselves on something. Yes, we can do that, but that something is still depending on things that are revolving around. It says it can't change. Even if it remains likely to be in a certain fashion, it's never quite in that fashion, because at the end of the day, you don't even know what that something really is. And it's already an enterprise to try to find out, to define it for what it is. And it's factually impossible. And that's what von Clausewitz is saying in this paragraph. That you can't even take into account endless elements of the whole picture. But when you have to take action, well, most of them are not useless, but they're kind of useless in proportion to what you have to do. And that's where practicality is, and why this is not an abstraction. This is why von Clausewitz is interested exclusively throughout the whole Vom Kriege in stating exclusively, I repeat it, what has a practical effect. Because the reason why he wrote this is to actually have a use for people who read it, who study it, not just for speculating on what war is. And that's why we do have prejudices towards, thinkers, philosophers, people who lose their heads in the hyper-uranium, and rightly so, because most intellectualists, we can say, reason in that term. But that's where they're wrong, and that's why von Clausewitz, albeit being definitely a hell of an intellectual, doesn't fall into the same trap those guys did. And that's why he's actually better than that, because he's a person who is able to remain morally absolute, let's say, and not make moral relativism out of the difficulties that are evidently presented by reality, but at the same time doesn't even indulge into the idea, okay, we need to abstract something out of this equation, otherwise we can't calculate anything precisely from a sheer mathematical point of view. Well, because at that point you wouldn't even have something that works properly. And this is this middle ground, that is not a compromise. I mean, in part it is a compromise, methodologically speaking, because he's stating here that you will never get that precise number proper, but you kind of get that at the end of the day when you have to take action for real. And that's it's on that realization based on experience that you will have to be able to build something upon it. That is a theory of the art of war, and that works. That's the thing. The theory of the art of war is not another abstraction like the others have tried to build, but it's the Clausewitzian one actually works because it's substantiated with actual historical evidence. It's not a construction of things that do not pertain. In fact, it's quite difficult, and even in there, von Clausewitz doesn't tell you that there is a theory that at that point resolves every problem, but there is a theory that at least makes you in the condition of knowing what you will have to cope with in general, and therefore stay prepared for it, and to eventually take action in an effective manner. That is no grant of victory, but it's still, no assurance of defeat. And then there is the strictly didactic thing here that is reflecting on the nature of the strictly military instrument, right? When you have your own armed forces, at that point you have to mind how to feed them and so on, etc. But what concerns strategy is exclusively combat, because we have seen that strategy is modeled with the aim of peace through victory that passes through single combat, single tactical encounters that are given sense by strategy that cannot work otherwise, because those tactical engagements are the same base of which strategy, the same means through which strategy, by which strategy works. So, once again, this is not to forget that there is politics intervening in that, there is society intervening in that, but what pertains to the military stuff is what strategy is concerned of, and the rest is something different. The rest is literally politics. It's literally social, sciences, etc. And you should always keep them in mind because they help you. They're never detached, right? The Clausewitzian Trinity implies that quite clearly. All right. Actually, military action is dominated by politics at every single time. There's not a moment in which war is set free. There are wars that are more destructive, that tends more towards the total form, right? But they're never quite that, because there's always someone who's fighting them for a specific reason that has nothing to do with the military instrument in itself, but just with the force that the moral force that animates it, and of course even the material side of the story that is equally important, but it's subordinated to the moral one. And here von Clausewitz makes other examples. For example, he says strategy makes use of maps without troubling itself about triangulations. You need a map when you're, under attack. What are you wondering there? With how was the map built? Like, of course, if you have the map drawn, if you have other evidence in front of you, you collect other data, you can maybe redraw the map on your database. But von Clausewitz's question at that point is, but when you're under enemy fire, is that what you can think of? This is a very heavy statement. This is not a rhetorical question. It's really a matter of saying you will not care about that in that specific moment. You will care about that if what you have to take action for is really passes through that topographical need of finding out what that the terrain is. Let's assume, but at that point you don't care how the map has been drawn, because you're basically redrawing it by yourself, and with a certain degree of accuracy that is inversely proportional to the difficulties you're facing at that point, and the amount of time, directly proportional also to the amount of time and how much you can dedicate all it to that activity. And nor, von Clausewitz says here, nor strategy inquires how the country is subdivided into departments and provinces, and how the people are educated and governed in order to attain the best military results. Right? You get those means already prepared by someone else, fundamentally. And nor that you don't have to take into account, but always to a lesser extent, and separated from the theory of the art of war proper. It pertains to another sphere, right? This must be very clear, because you can even find yourself in a kind of a moral confusion at that point, because if you think that the military instrument fundamentally corresponds to laws that are tied to the amount of interference that you can make as a politician, let's say, that effectively happens, but it ceases to be military. Like von Clausewitz starts the Vom Kriege by saying, there are people who think that for humanitarian reason, for example, war should kind of refrain from kind of the higher violences. And he said, this is nonsense, right? It's conceptually not useful. Actually, more people will die if you don't employ your force with the maximum level for which you decided to attain a certain thing, right? Which doesn't mean you should use an atomic bomb to deal with your enemies. But aside from the constrictions of politics, war does operate like that. Must operate like that. And there are other things that intervene that are in this sense not just political or social, but they're actually physical. Humans tend to be lazier than they should be, right? But that's where the combination lays, that as long as politics gives this mandate to the military instrument, always kind of keeping it tied to itself, because it doesn't leave it not even for 1 second. Well, at that point, war should be that aggressive, should be that direct, it should be that devastating, because that's paradoxically the best way actually to spare human lives. Because a war that protracts itself just for the sake of it, as we all know, it's disastrous beyond belief. And it does happen. I mean, there are wars that need to be fought in that way as well, because you can't do otherwise, and that always happens in that regard. I mean, every war can be measured according to this, I mean, different standards. I mean, everything is relative in this sense, but the intention shouldn't be. And this naturally has to do with the commitment, and that's where the moral forces are involved, and that's why von Clausewitz believes, rightfully, that war is chiefly a clash between moral forces, because at that point it's the person who is most determined to achieve something that more likely will win, right? Even if it seems like this is naturally a generalist statement that doesn't take into consideration the fact that of course, one can be more determined, as we were saying before, while he's about to be wiped out. So at the end of a war, for example, but still there is the moral force of who is winning, who have gotten to arrive up to that point. That is not being merciful, because he wants to actually put an end to war that has cost him a lot as well, as soon as he could. Like say, we always make an example, World War II. That's exactly like that, right? And this doesn't exclude it can be made mistakes can be made. That this has nothing to do with pretending. I mean, in Vom Kriege, that every single action should be at this point calculated with this, level of expertise for which you're always going to do the right thing. Von Clausewitz tells you the same exact opposite. That it says that will not happen, but it still will follow a logic that at that point you will be confronted with, and that you will have to start from once again. And there are no discounts, right? So it gets von Clausewitz gets controversial in the sense that he's really presenting you what happens throughout the whole spectrum, and therefore he's not kind of making you fall into the illusion that things can come without a cost. And that's instead what we want to hear all the time. That's why it's so difficult sometimes to talk about these topics, because it's as if we didn't accept that. Even in the way we look at history, for example, history has been something terrible in itself. But not just because of the most obvious things. You can't think of the most greatest atrocities mankind has committed in itself, but for the inherent losses that always come from progress in itself. As we often say, progress is not an actual positive achievement, is more like a patch you put on something negative that happens to you. But that helps. And it helps for real, because we have arrived at the point at which we are faring definitely better than before. So that's the paradox, and that's the subtlety, let's say, and the genius of von Clausewitz. But we will insist naturally in this stuff in the future. So here are the people educating government. In von Clausewitz, he writes, but it takes things as it finds them in the community of European states, and observes where very different conditions have a notable influence on war. Right? And here, naturally, von Clausewitz is speaking like a European of the 19th century, so naturally he has this great confidence, and rightfully so, because actually it's from his own military thinking that Europe would evolve dramatically at that point. With this military theory, as we have observed in the last 200 years, and referring to the fact that objectively the Western world at the time was kind of the most advanced, and the United States, for example, as such, had
been just born, and also in the 19th century, Europeans actually maintained, partly because of Napoleonic and of eventually specifically Clausewitzian principles, that I don't know, the Americans were kind of amateurs of war. Like when they looked at the Civil War, they think, nah, but there were a lot of things they were actually already trying to sort out themselves with the wars of Crimea and of the ones of Italian independence, because a lot of things were changing there in terms of the art of war. So it's a bit of a prejudice, of course. Actually, the American Civil War deeply contributed to many of the developments of, especially in artillery, but not only, actually, that would prove dramatically important, even during World War the First, etc. But when you find von Clausewitz writing about this, he is not he's not a Western-centric in the bad sense of the world. He's simply stating the obvious, that at the time it was really like that, and now there was a great confidence. I mean, even the same Vom Kriege objectively does ride a little bit the wave of positivism in the measure. Normally in the opposite sense, which it usually does, but objectively realizing, and we have seen it in the first video we made on von Clausewitz in the introduction, how many discoveries, scientifically speaking, especially, were achieved at the time. It was amazing. It was really a world was feeling the possibility of changing and of getting better, and that's where we essentially come from. I mean, much of the even the living conditions had not changed since centuries at that point. During the 19th century, starting from the 19th century, we begin to have electricity, current water, etc. So this idea of getting something right, it passed also through the validation of something that really made a big difference, right, for our civilization. That's why in 2020 we're still studying von Clausewitz, because aside from all the criticism that the new prima donnas want to find about this guy, that he's so old, he's thinking about the 19th century, we should criticize him because now the nature of war has changed, because now we have drones, because now there is hybrid warfare, everything is so different. No, it's not. It's actually literally the same identical thing, like it was, and like it was before, and as it will ever be. And this guy found it out, right? And the reason of our failures today are, in fact, the same ones exactly that we're having at the time, with which, by the way, there are striking parallelisms that are the ones that effectively create problems. But that's why von Clausewitz is so, he's still here, right? Because if he had not worked, if he had not changed, if he had not provided us with certain insights, and we could have done better than what he did, we would have just passed ahead, like we would have surpassed him. This didn't happen, and let me bet that it will not happen in the future. And that's the confidence that it gives you to study this thing. Once you get it, then of course you can make your criticism. Like, I'm not I know I sound very self-assertive myself, because I'm backed by this work, thanks my eyes. It's one of the greatest works, the history of civilization. I have it easy to state these things, but that's why there should be a struggle at some point. I mean, I don't think any intellectual achievement is possible without getting, frustrated about it. Like, it's difficult to accept, for example, that someone else has already found out what you thought was such an original thinking, but it's exactly from your own personal experience that you can add something that, albeit maybe just comforting what other people have found, can enrich the picture and actually help other people to follow that path, and therefore creating from the negative realization, actually doing something positive about it for others. And this is, I think, what largely civilization is about. It's not pretending we'll ever solve certain problems in general, but the only realization of it is the path for solving many others that can help us improve in ways that we can't really foresee, but maybe will also change a lot. And von Clausewitz is the living proof of this, because he emerged from the destruction of his own country as such, and he passed through the entire Napoleonic Wars. So it's not that he had it particularly easy, right? He died, while on campaign, and that's a life spent with a lot of sacrifice. And we have now in our hands the product that's the fruit of that sacrifice, and we should realize that these pages are really that precious because of that. Unlike many others that are just pretty banal, in my opinion. Alright, so I think we stop it here. I don't think there is anything else to add. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.